The wagon rolled to a stop at high noon, dust swirling in the scorching desert air. Clyde Harrove's hands trembled as he clutched the letter from the matrimonial agency, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd ordered salvation in the form of a delicate woman who would need him, depend on him, make his lonely existence mean something. But when the canvas cover peeled back, what emerged made his breath catch in his throat. She unfolded from the wagon like a force of nature, nearly 7 feet of raw power, shoulders that could carry the world, wearing Apache leather and bone decorations that caught the sunlight. This wasn't the bride he'd ordered. And in exactly 3 minutes, when those dark eyes locked onto his, Clyde would discover he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Just not the mistake he thought. 3 years. 3 endless years of silence so thick it became another presence in his tiny wooden house. 3 years of watching sunsets alone, talking to the wind, slowly forgetting what human conversation even sounded like. The newspaper advertisement had appeared like divine intervention. Matrimonial agency, refined ladies seeking respectable gentlemen for marriage. Discretion assured. He'd written his letter with painstaking care, describing himself as a landowner with prospects, a generous exaggeration, and specifically, explicitly requesting someone delicate, educated, fragile enough to need his protection. The response came 6 weeks later. Your bride will arrive on the 15th. Payment required upon delivery. Be prepared to honor your commitment. He'd spent the last week in frantic preparation, sweeping dust that returned the moment he finished, repairing the broken shutter on the front window, rehearsing words that now seemed laughably inadequate. Welcome. I'm Clyde. I'll take care of you. Simple words for what he'd hoped would be a simple arrangement. The wagon had appeared as a dark shape against the bright horizon, growing larger with each passing second until it stopped 20 feet from his door. The driver, a weathered man with tobacco-stained teeth, spat into the dust. Got your delivery, Harrove. Clyde stepped forward, squinting against the midday glare, watching as the driver moved to the back of the wagon. The canvas rustled. A hand emerged, not small and pale as he'd imagined, but strong, brown, gripping the wagon's edge with fingers that looked capable of breaking wood. Then she stood, and kept standing. She rose from the wagon's interior like something from a fever dream, her head clearing the canvas top by half a foot. Traditional Apache clothing, leather decorated with beads and fringe that swayed with each breath. Hair falling past her shoulders in long, dark waves, small braids woven through and adorned with bone and turquoise. Her face held a beauty that came with strength. High cheekbones and eyes that seemed to see straight through him, reading every doubt, every fear, every inadequacy he'd ever hidden. She held a leather traveling bag in one hand as if it weighed nothing. The driver cleared his throat. This here's Kaia, your bride. Contracts paid in full. No refunds. Clyde tried to speak. His voice came out strangled. There's been a mistake. Kaia's eyes moved to him for the first time. She didn't smile, didn't frown. She simply looked at him the way someone might look at a problem they hadn't expected but would solve anyway. No mistake. The agency sent me. You requested a wife. Not you, he wanted to shout. Not this. But the words stuck, because even thinking them felt cruel, felt wrong, felt like exactly what he was, a man who'd ordered another human being like merchandise and now wanted to return her because she didn't match the catalog description. The driver thrust a paper toward him. Sign here, confirms delivery. Clyde's hand shook as he took it. I specifically asked for someone. His voice trailed off. How could he say it without revealing exactly what kind of pathetic, controlling coward he really was? Kaia stepped down from the wagon. The ground seemed to shake, though Clyde knew that was impossible, knew it was just his world tilting on its axis. She stood a full head taller than him, maybe more. When she moved, it wasn't with careful, dainty steps. She moved like someone who'd never questioned whether the ground would hold her weight, never doubted her right to take up space in the world. Sign. The driver shoved the paper forward again. I got another delivery 3 territories over. Clyde signed. His signature looked like a child's scrawl, trembling and uncertain. The driver pocketed the paper, climbed back onto his seat, and snapped the reins. The wagon pulled away, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the air between Clyde and the woman who was now, according to a binding legal contract, his wife. They stood in silence. The desert wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and dry earth, and the weight of expectations completely shattered. Kaia set her bag down with deliberate care, her movements precise and controlled. You are Clyde Harrove. It wasn't a question. Yes. The agency showed me your letter. You wanted a wife for your property, someone to help build a life. Yes, but I am here. She said it the way someone might state a fact of nature. The sun rises, water flows downward. I am here. Deal with it. Clyde felt sweat running down his back despite the dry air. There's only one room inside. The food is simple, I don't... He stopped. Didn't what? Didn't expect you. Didn't want you. Didn't prepare for someone who wouldn't need him at all, who would make him feel smaller instead of larger, who would expose every fantasy he'd built as exactly that, fantasy. I wasn't prepared for this, he finally said, the understatement of his life. For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, not quite sympathy. Something harder, more knowing. She picked up her bag. Then we will both learn to be unprepared together. She walked past him toward the house, moving with a confidence that made his small dwelling look even smaller, more pathetic, more obviously the shelter of a man barely surviving rather than actually living. Clyde stood frozen, watching her broad shoulders disappear through his doorway, filling it completely. The sun beat down on his head. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, and it sounded like laughter. What had he done? More importantly, what was he supposed to do now? He'd paid in full. The contract was binding. The matrimonial agency had a reputation for legal enforcement, and the woman now standing in his house, examining his meager possessions with those penetrating eyes, was nothing, absolutely nothing, like he'd imagined his future would be. He heard her voice from inside. You keep no weapons in your home? Clyde walked slowly toward his own front door, feeling like a stranger approaching a building he'd never seen before. I have a rifle in the corner. Only one. Her tone held something he couldn't identify. Judgment, surprise, disappointment. Where I come from, every person carries at least 3 ways to protect themselves. He stopped in the doorway. She stood in the center of the single room, somehow making the entire space feel different. Smaller, yes, but also more filled, more occupied, as if she claimed not just physical space, but something else, some quality of presence he'd never experienced, never even knew was possible. This is everything I have, he heard himself say, and it was true in more ways than one. 1 room, 1 bed, 1 table, 2 chairs, a fireplace, a shelf with 3 books. This is all I am. She turned to look at him fully. Her eyes held no mockery, no disappointment, just a steady measuring gaze that made him feel simultaneously exposed and strangely seen for the first time in years. Then we will see if it is enough. The way she said it, Clyde couldn't tell if she meant the house or him, and that uncertainty, that not knowing, would haunt him through the long, strange night ahead. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the loose shutter he'd forgotten to fix despite all his preparations. The sound felt like laughter, like the desert itself mocking his careful plans. He stepped inside his own home and closed the door, feeling more like a stranger in his own life than he'd ever felt before. And as Kaia moved to the window to look out at the land that was now supposedly hers too, Clyde wondered what the agency had seen in his letter that made them think this match made any sense at all. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, as he watched her standing there like a force of nature contained in human form, was that the agency hadn't made a mistake at all. They'd made a choice, a very deliberate choice. And by sunset, everything he thought he knew about himself would begin to crumble. The silence between them felt heavier than the desert heat. Clyde stood with his back against the door, while Kaia examined his home with the careful attention of someone evaluating a purchase or a prison. She touched nothing, but her eyes missed nothing either. "You built this yourself?" "Yes." Pride crept into his voice despite everything. 3 years ago. Hauled every board myself. "It needs repair." The pride died instantly. "I know that." She moved to the window, her movements fluid and purposeful. "How much property?" 40 acres. Water source half a mile east. He heard himself explaining, though she hadn't asked for details, filling the silence with words because silence felt dangerous now. "Not enough for cattle. I grow what I can." "Where will I sleep?" The question struck him cold, made his chest tighten. "The bed. I can make a place by the fire." "You paid for a wife, not a guest." Clyde's face burned. "We don't know each other. It wouldn't be proper." Proper. She turned from the window, and something in her expression cut through him like a blade. "You wanted a wife without knowing her, but sleeping in the same room is improper. Explain to me how that makes sense." "That's different." "How?" He had no answer that wouldn't make him sound like exactly what he was, a hypocrite, a coward, a man who wanted control without intimacy, companionship without connection. "I will sleep by the fire tonight." She set her bag on the table with a decisive thump. "Tomorrow we discuss how this works." "Thank you." "Do not thank me for taking the floor of my own house." The words stung because they were true. This was her house now, according to the contract he'd signed without reading carefully, without thinking through the implications. He'd been so desperate for company, so starved for human connection, that he'd signed away half his life to a stranger. As darkness fell, they moved around each other like strangers in a crowded room, which, Clyde realized, they literally were. Kaia refused his offer of food, instead pulling dried meat from her bag. She ate standing, watching the last light fade from the window, her posture alert, in a way that suggested she'd spent years never fully relaxing. Clyde sat at the table, choking down bread he couldn't taste, watching her from the corner of his eye, and wondering what her life had been like before this, what had driven her to accept a contract marriage with a stranger in the middle of nowhere. When full darkness came, she spread a blanket near the fireplace with practiced efficiency. No complaints, no requests, no demands. She lay down, turned toward the wall, and within minutes, her breathing changed to sleep's steady rhythm, or at least the rhythm of someone pretending to sleep, someone who'd learned to rest while remaining alert. Clyde remained at the table. He'd spent 3 years alone, but he'd never felt lonelier than right now with another person 6 feet away. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd ordered a bride to cure his loneliness, and instead, he'd imported a stranger who made the isolation feel even more profound. He finally moved to bed as the fire burned to coals. Through the darkness, he could barely make out her form, a shadow against shadows. She slept utterly still, more certain of her place even in sleep than he'd ever been awake. His dreams were restless, fragmented. He woke once in deep night to find her sitting upright, looking toward the door with complete alertness, her hand resting near something in her bag, a knife, probably, or something worse. This wasn't fear. This was readiness born from experience he couldn't imagine, from a life he'd never understand. He closed his eyes, pretending sleep, and when he opened them again, gray dawn filtered through the window. The blanket lay empty and folded. The door stood open. Kaia was gone. Panic seized him. He rushed outside, cold morning air hitting sharp and immediate. He scanned frantically, his heart hammering. She'd left. Of course she'd left. Why would she stay? What could this place possibly offer someone like her? Then he saw her 50 yards out, facing the rising sun with her arms raised, palms up, speaking words he couldn't hear. Not prayer, something else. Something older and more fundamental. The wind moved through her hair, and for a moment she looked carved from the desert itself, permanent and elemental. He stepped back inside, feeling like an intruder, witnessing something sacred. He started the fire, his hands shaking not from cold, but from something else, some emotion he couldn't name. When she returned, she brought the smell of sage with her. "You are awake early." "Couldn't sleep." She moved to her bag, pulling out a leather roll that unfolded to reveal strange tools, implements he'd never seen before, carved and shaped for purposes he could only guess. "Your land has good bones, poor water management, weak fencing. I've done the best I can alone." "Yes." She tucked a tool into her belt, not looking at him. "That is the problem. You have been doing everything alone. Today, that changes." "What do you mean?" "We fix the fence, then dig proper irrigation, then reinforce this house before the next storm." "I didn't ask." "You asked for a wife." She moved toward the door, her movements decisive. "I am not decoration. I am a partner, or I am nothing. Choose which." She walked out, leaving him feeling simultaneously insulted and strangely excited, challenged in a way he'd never been before. He grabbed his hat and followed. The sun had risen, turning the desert gold and amber. She stood examining the fence line, her shadow long across the dust, her stance that of someone evaluating battlefield terrain. "You coming or just watching?" He approached. "What do we do first?" She handed him a tool, their fingers brushing, the first intentional physical contact between them. "First you learn that partnership means both people work. Equal weight, equal burden, equal reward." "I don't know if I can do that." "Then you will learn, or you will fail." She started walking toward the fence. "Either way, we start now." Walking beside her, not behind, not ahead, but beside. Clyde realized everything felt different. The ground itself seemed shifted by her presence, the air charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. He gripped the unfamiliar tool and wondered what he'd actually signed up for. The contract said she was his wife. But looking at her stride confidently across land she'd seen for the first time yesterday, examining it with eyes that missed nothing, he suspected the reality would be far more complicated than any paper could capture, and far more dangerous to his carefully constructed isolation than he'd ever imagined possible. The fence was worse than Clyde remembered, or maybe he'd been lying to himself for months, pretending decay was acceptable. Posts leaned at desperate angles like drunken sentries. Wire sagged like abandoned spiderwebs, useless for containing anything. In his 3 years alone, he'd told himself it was good enough, told himself he'd fix it next season, told himself all the comfortable lies of someone slowly giving up. Looking at it now through Kaia's eyes, he saw it for what it was, barely standing, a monument to his own mediocrity. She knelt beside the first post, testing its stability with one hand. The wood shifted immediately, yielding like rotted teeth. "How long has it been like this?" 2 seasons, maybe 3. "And you wonder why animals cross your land freely." She stood, moving to the next post with the efficiency of someone conducting a military inspection. "This entire section needs replacing, not repair." "Replacement." He swallowed hard. "I don't have enough wood for that." "Then we make do with what we have." She pulled the strange tool from her belt, examining the post spacing with calculating eyes. "We dig deeper, reinforce with stone, make weak things strong through different means." Clyde watched as she began working, her movements efficient and purposeful, no wasted motion. She didn't ask for his help or wait for instruction. She simply started, as if the fence's weakness personally offended her, as if failure wasn't an option she'd ever considered. He knelt beside her, trying to match her rhythm. His hands felt clumsy compared to hers, like a child trying to imitate an artist. "Where did you learn this?" "My father." She didn't look up, her focus absolute. "Before the soldiers came." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Clyde wanted to ask more, needed to ask more, but something in the set of her shoulders warned him off, told him that some stories could only be offered, never demanded. Instead, he focused on the work, digging where she indicated, following her lead with increasing confidence. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace. Sweat soaked through his shirt within an hour. Kaia worked without apparent effort, her strength making tasks look simple that left him straining and gasping. When he struggled to lift a heavy stone, she moved it with one hand while continuing to work with the other, her expression unchanged. "You don't need to prove anything." He looked up, surprised. Her voice held no mockery, no judgment, just simple observation. "Work smart, not desperate," she continued. "You are digging like a man trying to show he belongs on his own land. You already belong here. Inefficiency does not change that." "How do you know what I'm thinking?" "Because I have seen that look before." She glanced at him briefly. "In my brother's face when he tried to hunt like my father. In my sister when she tried to weave like my mother. The look of someone measuring themselves against the wrong standard. What's the right standard? Getting the work done." She returned to the post, her hands moving with practiced precision. "Everything else is ego." They worked in silence after that, but it was different now. Not the uncomfortable silence of the previous night, but something else. The silence of two people focused on the same task, their movements gradually finding a rhythm together, a synchronization that felt almost musical. By midday, they'd reinforced 4 posts. Clyde's hands were raw, blisters forming on blisters. His back ached with a deep, bone-level pain that would last days. But something felt different, better. The fence stood straighter, more solid. More importantly, he'd contributed something real, something that would last. Kaia straightened suddenly, looking toward the horizon with narrowed eyes. "Storm coming." Clyde followed her gaze. The sky remained clear, unmarked by clouds, perfect and blue. "I don't see anything." "You will." She began gathering the tools with sudden urgency. 2 hours. Maybe 3. We need to prepare. It's not storm season. The air tells a different story. She started walking back toward the house, her pace quick but controlled. "Believe what you see or believe what nature shows you. Your choice." "How can you possibly know?" She stopped, turning back, and her expression was serious in a way that made his chest tighten. "Because I pay attention, because I listen, because I learned that the world speaks constantly to those willing to hear it." There was no challenge in her voice, no superiority, just fact, stated plainly, like explaining that water is wet or fire is hot. Clyde looked at the clear sky again, then back at Kaia already halfway to the house. Every instinct told him she was wrong, that she was overreacting, that he knew his own land better than some stranger who'd been here less than 24 hours. But those same instincts had told him the fence was good enough, that he could manage alone, that a delicate wife was what he needed. Maybe his instincts were the problem. Maybe he'd been wrong about everything. He gathered his tools and followed. As he walked, he noticed things he'd ignored before. The way the birds had gone quiet, their usual afternoon chatter absent. How the air felt pressed down, heavier than heat alone could explain. The distant horizon where the blue seemed darker than it should, almost bruised. By the time he reached the house, Kaia had already begun preparations. She'd moved everything loose inside: tools, buckets, anything the wind could claim. She'd closed and latched the shutters he'd forgotten to fix properly, working with the calm urgency of someone who'd done this before, who'd learned through harsh experience that preparation meant survival. "Help me secure the roof." She pointed to where his patch looked weakest, the section he knew was vulnerable but had kept putting off. If wind hits hard, that section goes first. They climbed up, working quickly now, Clyde's earlier exhaustion forgotten in the face of her certainty. His hands shook slightly, not from exertion but from the growing conviction that she was right, that something was coming, that his comfortable denial was about to meet reality. As they hammered the final board into place, the first wind gust hit. Not strong, but wrong, somehow. Too warm, too sudden, coming from a direction the wind never came from. Kaia looked toward the horizon, and her expression shifted, something Clyde couldn't read passing across her face like a shadow. "We need to get down now." "What's wrong?" "That." She pointed. Clyde turned and felt his stomach drop into a void. The horizon had darkened to bruised purple, angry and swollen. Above it, the sky roiled with clouds that seemed to appear from nothing, spreading like spilled ink across blue paper, or like blood in water, dark and inexorable. Lightning flickered inside them, too far away to hear but bright enough to see in daylight, illuminating the clouds from within like diseased veins. The storm wasn't 2 hours away. It was racing toward them like something alive and hungry, and as the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and something else, something wild and electric and dangerous, Clyde realized that his tiny house with its patched roof and his 40 acres of hard-won land suddenly felt very small and very vulnerable. He looked at Kaia, her hair whipping in the strengthening wind, her eyes fixed on the approaching darkness with an expression that was part respect, part calculation, but absolutely no fear. For the first time since she'd arrived, he was grateful she was here. More than grateful. Relieved. Because whatever was coming, he had the distinct feeling that facing it alone would have been far worse than facing it with someone who looked at approaching storms the way warriors looked at battles. With respect, yes. With concern, certainly. But absolutely no fear. And that would make all the difference. They barely made it inside before the storm hit with the force of divine wrath. The wind arrived first, slamming against the house with enough force to rattle the door in its frame, making the walls creak in protest. Then came the rain, not falling, but driving, sideways, each drop hitting like a thrown stone, like nature itself had declared war on this small wooden structure and everything inside it. Clyde pressed his weight against the door, while Kaia moved through the small space with urgent efficiency, checking every weak point: the window shutters, the roof patch, the gaps in the walls where weather could force its way through like an invading army. "There." She pointed to the corner where roof met wall. Water was already seeping through, a dark stain spreading across the wood like disease, like failure made visible. "We need to block it from inside." "With what?" She was already moving, pulling her blanket from near the fireplace without hesitation. "This. Help me." They climbed onto the table together, the space suddenly intimate in its smallness, their shoulders touching, their breath mingling in the confined space above. Thunder cracked so close the house seemed to shake, the sound so loud it felt physical, like being inside a drum being beaten by giants. "Hold it steady." Her voice remained calm despite the violence surrounding them, that unshakable composure that made him feel simultaneously inadequate and safe. "I need both hands." She worked quickly, using strips torn from her own belongings to tie the blanket in place, creating a barrier against the invasion of water and weather. Her face was inches from his, close enough that he could see a small scar above her left eyebrow, the kind of scar that told a story, that spoke of violence survived and lessons learned. Close enough to smell sage and leather and something else he couldn't name, something that was just her, unique and unmistakable. The blanket held. Water stopped seeping through that corner. But as they climbed down, another leak appeared on the opposite side, nature mocking their efforts, showing them that victory was temporary at best. "The patch you made," Kaia pointed, already moving. "It is not enough. I know that now. Knowing does nothing." She grabbed his water bucket with decisive force. "We fix it." For the next hour, they fought the storm from inside like soldiers defending a fortress. Every leak they stopped seemed to spawn two more, as if the storm was learning, adapting, finding new ways to break through their defenses. Water pooled on the floor, turning the packed earth to mud. The wind found cracks Clyde never knew existed, whistling through them with sounds almost human, like screams, like laughter, like voices calling from beyond the world. At one point, a gust hit so hard the entire structure shifted with an audible crack. Clyde froze, certain the house would collapse, certain this was the moment everything came apart and they'd be exposed to the full fury of nature's violence. But Kaia was already moving, bracing the wall that had shifted, wedging the table against it for support with movements so quick they seemed rehearsed, planned for. "Here." She gestured for him to help, her voice cutting through the storm's roar. "Push with me." They leaned their combined weight against the wall, holding it steady while the storm raged, while thunder shook the foundations and lightning turned the cracks in the shutters bright white, like the world was ending and being reborn in rapid succession. Minutes passed, then more, time losing meaning in the chaos. Clyde's arms burned with effort, his back screamed protest, every muscle in his body demanding he give up, let go, accept defeat. But Kaia showed no sign of weakening. Her body pressed against his as they held the wall together, so neither did he. If she could endure, he would endure. If she wouldn't quit, he wouldn't quit. The storm's fury peaked, reaching a crescendo that seemed impossible to survive. Wind howled like something wild and wounded, like every demon in creation was trying to tear through the walls. Rain hammered the roof with deafening rhythm, each impact sounding like the roof itself would shatter. Lightning turned the world white with such frequency that darkness became the exception rather than the rule. Thunder followed instantly, so loud Clyde felt it in his chest, in his bones, like his heart was being defibrillated again and again. Then, gradually, slowly, as if reconsidering its decision to destroy them, the violence lessened. The wind's howl dropped to a moan. The rain's hammer became merely drumming, still heavy but survivable. The lightning moved away, traveling across the desert to terrorize someone else, thunder following seconds behind instead of simultaneous. They remained braced against the wall, neither willing to trust the storm's retreat, both knowing that nature was treacherous, and storms had been known to return for a second attack, just when you thought you were safe. Finally, Kaia straightened, testing the structure with careful pressure. "It holds, for now." Clyde stepped back, his arms shaking from sustained effort, his whole body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. He looked around his home, water everywhere, belongings scattered. The careful order he'd maintained for 3 years demolished in an hour, reduced to chaos and mud, and the smell of wet wood and defeat. Kaia surveyed the damage with the same calm she'd shown throughout the storm, as if disaster was just another day, another problem, another thing to solve. It could have been worse. "How?" Clyde heard the defeat in his own voice, the weight of loss pressing down. "Everything is ruined." "No." She moved through the space, already planning, already seeing beyond the immediate damage to what came next. "The walls stand, the roof remains. These are things that can be dried, repaired, restored." She turned to face him, water dripping from her hair, her clothes soaked through, but her eyes clear and certain. "You are alive. I am alive. The rest is just work." Just work. He wanted to laugh at the simplicity of it, the way she reduced catastrophe to mere inconvenience. Or maybe cry. Maybe both. I couldn't have survived this alone, he admitted, the words coming out before he could stop them, before pride could intervene. But you did not have to. She wrung water from a blanket, her hands strong and capable, making the heavy fabric yield like it weighed nothing. That was the point of asking for a wife, was it not? To not be alone. I wanted someone who needed me. The admission came out raw, honest, stripped of all pretense by exhaustion and fear. Someone I could protect. Protection is not what makes a partner valuable. She hung the blanket over a chair to dry, her movements methodical. My mother told me once that the best marriages are not about one person sheltering another from storms. They are about two people standing together inside them. Clyde looked at her, this woman who was nothing like what he'd imagined he wanted, nothing like what he'd thought he needed. She stood in his ruined home without complaint, already planning repairs, acting as if this disaster was simply another task to complete, another challenge to overcome. The delicate, grateful wife of his imagination would have been useless here, worse than useless, terrified, hysterical, another burden to carry instead of a partner to share the load. But Kaia had read the storm's approach in clear skies while he'd seen nothing, had known exactly what to do and how to do it, had held the wall steady without question or panic while everything fell apart around them, had been the reason they'd survived at all. I was wrong, he said quietly, the words feeling like both confession and revelation, about what I wanted, what I thought I needed. She paused in her work, meeting his eyes with an expression that was almost soft, almost vulnerable. And now? Now I think... He searched for the right words, feeling them form in his mind like shapes emerging from fog. I think maybe the agency knew something I didn't, saw something I couldn't see. A slight smile touched her lips, the first he'd seen, transforming her face into something luminous. Perhaps they saw that a man living alone in the desert did not need someone to protect. He needed someone strong enough to help him survive. The storm continued its retreat, leaving only steady rain drumming on the roof like an afterthought, like nature apologizing for its earlier violence. They worked together in the growing quiet, moving water outside, salvaging what could be saved, their movements synchronized now in a way they hadn't been before. The work was hard, exhausting, but no longer desperate. Something had shifted between them during the storm's fury. Some wall had come down, though Clyde couldn't say exactly when. Maybe when they'd held the wall together, maybe when she'd torn her own blanket to save his roof, maybe in 1,000 small moments he hadn't even noticed. As darkness fell and they finally stopped to rest, sitting on the floor because everything else was too wet, Clyde realized he was exhausted in a way that felt good, clean, earned. Not the exhaustion of futility, but the exhaustion of accomplishment, of shared struggle overcome. He glanced at Kaia, her hair loose and damp, her clothes soaked through, her expression peaceful despite everything, despite the disaster, despite being trapped with a stranger, despite having every reason to regret the contract that had brought her here. "Thank you," he said simply, "for knowing what to do." She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something new, not warmth exactly, not yet, but recognition. Respect, perhaps. The acknowledgement that he'd stood beside her when it mattered, that he hadn't broken when tested. "You are welcome," she replied, "for holding steady when I needed you." That small acknowledgement meant more than it should have, struck deeper than praise had any right to. They sat in silence, listening to rain on the roof, to water dripping from eaves, to the desert settling into its nighttime rhythms. And for the first time since she'd arrived, for the first time in 3 years really, Clyde didn't feel like a man who'd made a terrible mistake. He felt like someone who might possibly, with time and effort, have accidentally stumbled into something he didn't understand yet, but might learn to. Something that could be valuable. Something that could be real. Outside, thunder rumbled distant and retreating, heading toward some other horizon to terrorize some other soul. Inside, two people sat in a damaged home that had survived its test, that had bent but not broken. The night stretched ahead, uncertain and wet and uncomfortable, but no longer quite so lonely. And somewhere in that shared exhaustion, in that mutual survival, the first fragile threads of something more than obligation began to form. Neither of them spoke of it, neither of them acknowledged it, but both of them felt it, and that was enough. For now. Morning revealed the storm's full damage with merciless clarity. Clyde stepped outside into air scrubbed clean and painfully bright, the desert washed raw and exposed. His fence, the section they'd just repaired, the work they'd poured hours into, lay flattened like matchsticks, posts snapped or pulled from the ground, wire twisted into useless tangles. The small garden he'd been nursing for months had become a muddy ruin, plants torn up and scattered, months of work erased in hours. Debris lay scattered across his property, some of it his, some carried from unknown distances by wind that had reshuffled the desert like shuffling cards. He stood there taking inventory of loss, feeling the weight of it settle in his chest like stones. 3 years of work, 3 years of barely maintaining, of clinging to survival by his fingernails, all of it set back by one night, one storm, nature's reminder that humans were temporary and fragile and ultimately irrelevant. Kaia emerged from the house, her hair braided tight, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the destruction with calculating eyes. She walked past him without speaking, moving toward the fence line with purpose. Clyde followed, uncertain what to say, what to do, how to process this latest failure in a life that felt increasingly defined by them. She knelt beside a fallen post, examining where it had broken with the focus of someone conducting an autopsy. "The wood is good." She looked up at him, and there was no judgment in her eyes, just assessment. "It broke because the foundation was weak. We can use this. Build better." "How?" Clyde gestured at the wreckage, feeling hopelessness rising in his throat like bile. "I don't even know where to start. I can't afford new materials. This set me back months." "You start by not standing still." She pulled the broken post free with a sharp tug. "We salvage what we can. Then we rebuild stronger than before." "With what money? What resources? I can't just—" "Then we work with what the storm brought." She pointed to a large branch that had landed near the house, still green and solid, seasoned by lightning and wind. "That wood is strong, tested. The storm took from you, but it also gave. You just have to see it." Clyde wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she didn't understand how hard he'd worked, how discouraging it was to see it all undone, how every setback felt like proof that he was fundamentally inadequate, that his father had been right to dismiss him, that everyone who'd ever doubted him had been justified in their doubt. But looking at her, already moving, already working, already solving problems, while he stood paralyzed by self-pity, he realized something with sudden, sharp clarity. She'd lost more than a fence. The thought came sudden and certain, cutting through his fog of defeat. She'd lost something far bigger than his small, struggling farm could represent. Lost enough that starting over didn't frighten her anymore. Lost enough that destruction was just another challenge, not a catastrophe. Lost enough that she'd learned to see what remained rather than what was gone. "What happened to your people?" The question came out before he could stop it, blunt and intrusive. Kaia's hands stilled on the branch, her whole body going still in a way that made him regret asking. Then she resumed her work, her voice carefully neutral. "They were moved by soldiers who decided the land was not ours to keep." "I'm sorry, I can't imagine—" "Sorry does not rebuild fences." She hefted the branch, carrying it toward the house with apparent ease, muscles flexing under her shirt. Neither does standing still. He helped her carry wood, following her lead, trying to match her rhythm. They worked through morning into afternoon, sorting salvageable materials from true loss, creating order from chaos, one piece at a time. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert back into a furnace, yesterday's rain already evaporating into memory. At one point, they found a bird's nest that had survived the storm intact, wedged between fallen branches, its intricate weaving somehow undamaged despite the violence that had surrounded it. Kaia picked it up carefully, examining the delicate construction with something like reverence. The mother will not return. Clyde felt compelled to fill the silence, to acknowledge the sadness of it. No, I suppose she won't. But she will build again somewhere else. She set the nest down gently, her fingers lingering on it for just a moment. Living things adapt or they do not survive. There is no third option. Is that what you're doing? Adapting? She looked at him directly, her dark eyes holding his. Is that not what we both do? You asked for one thing and received another. I agreed to one situation and found something different. We adapt or we fail. These are the only choices. What if I'm not good at adapting? What if I keep failing? Then you learn the same way you learn anything else. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. By doing it badly until you do it better. There is no other path. They returned to work, the conversation settling between them like sediment in water, heavy and present, but no longer agitated. As the sun climbed higher, Clyde's shirt soaked through with sweat within an hour. His hands, already raw from yesterday, began to blister in new places, the pain sharp and immediate. He didn't complain, didn't slow down. Kaia worked beside him, matching his pace, sometimes exceeding it, her stamina seemingly endless. When he struggled to move a heavy log, she simply took one end while he took the other. No judgment, no commentary on his lesser strength, no making him feel weak for needing help, just partnership, simple and unadorned. By late afternoon, they'd cleared most of the debris and begun sorting materials for rebuilding. Clyde's arms trembled with exhaustion, his back felt like it might never straighten again, his whole body screaming for rest. But looking at what they'd accomplished together, the sorted piles, the salvaged materials, the cleared space where chaos had been, he felt something unexpected rising in his chest. Pride. Not the defensive pride of doing everything alone, of refusing help, of proving he didn't need anyone. Something different, deeper. The satisfaction of shared effort, of combined capability exceeding individual limitation, of being part of something larger than himself. We should stop. Kaia straightened, looking at the sky where the sun was beginning its descent. Rest is part of work. Tomorrow, we start rebuilding. Clyde nodded, too tired for words, every muscle in his body grateful for permission to stop. They walked back to the house together, their shadows stretching long across the salvaged wood, their footsteps falling into unconscious synchronization. Inside, the space still smelled of damp, but most of the water had been removed, the mud swept out. It looked bare, temporary, stripped of comfort, but inhabitable. They'd survived. That counted for something. Kaia opened her bag and pulled out dried meat and something wrapped in cloth, bread, flat and dark, unlike anything he'd ever seen. She offered half to Clyde without ceremony. Eat. Work requires fuel. They sat on the floor again, eating in silence. Not uncomfortable silence anymore. Just the quiet of two people too exhausted for conversation, too tired to pretend, too worn down to maintain the barriers people normally kept between them. Clyde chewed the unfamiliar bread, finding it dense and slightly sweet, with flavors he couldn't identify. Herbs, maybe, or seeds, something that spoke of a culture and cuisine he knew nothing about. It tasted nothing like what he usually ate. It tasted better. Your mother taught you to make this? Yes. Kaia's voice was soft, distant. Before everything changed. Yes. Do you miss it? Your life before? She considered this, chewing thoughtfully, her eyes distant. I miss parts of it. My mother's voice, my father's laugh, the way my sister would argue with everyone about everything, picking fights for the joy of winning them. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. But missing does not mean I can return, only that I remember. Is that enough? It has to be. She looked at him, the smile fading. You ask many questions today. I'm trying to understand. Understand what? You. This. Why you're here when you could have refused the contract. Why you're not angry about being sent to marry a stranger. Why you... He struggled to articulate what he was feeling. Why you're making this work instead of fighting it. I could not refuse. The contract was paid. The agency... She paused, something flickering across her face. The agency made an offer when I had few options, but you are right that I am not angry about it. Why not? Because anger would change nothing. She wrapped the remaining bread carefully, her movements precise. Resentment would not make the fence stronger or the house drier or my situation different. I am here. You are here. We can make this something worthwhile or we can make it misery. I chose which one it will be. Just like that? Just like that. She met his eyes, and he saw steel there, determination forged in fires he'd never know. Life gives you very few choices about what happens to you, but you always choose how you meet it, standing or fallen, fighting or surrendering, adapting or breaking. She paused. My people were moved from our land, but they did not break us. This situation is smaller, easier. Why would I let it defeat me? Clyde had no answer to that. He thought about his 3 years alone, how he'd let every small setback feel like proof of his inadequacy, how he'd built walls of isolation and called it self-sufficiency, how he'd imagined rescue in the form of someone delicate who would need him, because needing someone felt safer than being needed by someone strong, because being needed meant he could fail them, disappoint them, prove inadequate. I think I've been afraid, he admitted quietly. My whole life, really. Of what? Of not being enough, of failing, of proving that everyone who ever doubted me was right. He stared at his blistered hands. And now I think maybe I was measuring wrong. I kept trying to be enough by myself, to prove I didn't need help. Maybe that was never the point. Kaia nodded slowly, something like understanding softening her expression. My father used to say that 1 log burns quickly, 2 logs burn longer, 3 logs can burn through the night. She paused. He did not say this because logs are weak alone. He said it because fire grows stronger when fed together. That's why you're not angry about being sent here. I am not angry because I see possibility. She stood, beginning to prepare her sleeping space with practiced efficiency. You have land, a home, the willingness to work. These are not small things. With partnership, they become larger. And if it doesn't work? If we can't make this work? Then we tried. She spread her blanket near the fire, the same spot as the first night, but somehow different now, claimed, familiar, hers. Failure is only permanent when you stop trying. Clyde watched her settle, watched her arrange her space with the same care she brought to everything, deliberate, thoughtful, complete. The storm had stripped away pretense from both of them, he realized. She'd seen him weak and struggling, paralyzed by fear and doubt. He'd seen her strong and certain, unshakable in crisis. Neither had turned away. Outside, the last light faded from the sky, day surrendering to night in the eternal cycle that cared nothing for human struggles or triumphs. The desert night birds began their calling, their voices rising in the darkness like prayers or warnings. Inside, Clyde lay in his bed, body aching everywhere, hands raw and bleeding in places, spirit somehow lighter than it had been in years, maybe ever. Tomorrow they would rebuild, not restore what was lost, but create something new from what remained. The thought should have terrified him, should have felt like just another opportunity to fail. Instead, it felt almost like hope. He closed his eyes and sleep came quickly, deep and dreamless, the sleep of someone who'd worked honestly and survived another day. And when morning broke with its harsh, unforgiving light, he woke to find Kaia already outside, her arms raised to greet the sun, her voice carrying words he didn't understand but could somehow feel, words of gratitude perhaps, or commitment, or simple acknowledgement that they'd survived another night and been given another day to try again. He rose and joined her outside, standing a respectful distance away, not wanting to intrude on something sacred. She glanced at him, surprise flickering across her face, before settling back into calm acceptance. "You do not have to stand with me." "I know," he said quietly, "but I want to." She nodded, turning back to the rising sun, and they stood together in silence, watching light spread across the damaged land like a blessing, like a promise, like the world offering them another chance to get it right. And for the first time since the storm, for the first time since she'd arrived, for the first time in years, really, Clyde felt like they were genuinely beginning something. Not what he'd planned, not what either had expected, but possibly something real. The kind of real that's built from wreckage. The kind that survives because it has to, because both people refuse to let it die. They were rebuilding the fence 3 days later when the riders appeared. 3 men on horseback coming from the direction of town, dust rising behind them like smoke signals announcing their approach. Clyde recognized them immediately. Merchants he'd traded with, men who knew him as the quiet landowner who kept to himself and rarely caused trouble, who paid his debts on time and asked for nothing. He felt Kaia stiffen beside him, her hand moving instinctively toward the tool belt at her waist, not reaching for a weapon, just the reflexive preparation of someone who'd learned through harsh experience to always be ready, to never be caught unaware. "It's fine," Clyde kept his voice low, reassuring. "They're from town, probably just checking after the storm." Probably, but her posture didn't relax, her body remaining coiled like a spring, ready. The riders pulled up 20 feet away, respecting the invisible boundary of property lines. The lead man, Carson, who owned the general store, had eyes that moved from Clyde to Kaia and back, taking in her height, her clothing, her Apache features, the way she stood with confidence most women he knew didn't show, wouldn't dare show. Harrove. Carson's greeting came cautious, careful, like approaching a potentially dangerous animal. "Heard the storm hit hard out this way. Came to see if you needed help." "We're managing." Clyde stepped slightly forward, aware of how it might look. His instinct to position himself between Kaia and strangers, to protect her even though she clearly needed no protection. But she stepped forward too, not behind him, beside him, claiming equal space. "This your wife?" Carson's voice carried something Clyde couldn't quite identify. Surprise, maybe, or disapproval carefully hidden. "The one from the agency?" "Yes," Kaia answered before Clyde could, her voice carrying easily across the distance, strong and clear. "I am Kaia, his wife." The word sounded strange in her mouth, formal, like speaking in a language not quite her own, like wearing clothes that didn't fit properly. One of the other riders, a younger man named Webb, leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing. "She's Apache." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, a judgment rendered before trial. "Yes." Kaia's chin lifted slightly, a warrior stance Clyde was beginning to recognize. "Is that a problem?" Webb exchanged glances with Carson, a whole conversation happening in that look. Concern, maybe, or conspiracy. Just surprising. Harrove here asked for a refined lady from back east. Someone. Proper. Plans change. Clyde heard the edge in his own voice, surprising himself with its sharpness. The agency sent who they sent, and I'm grateful for it. But did they tell you? Carson's tone took on something paternal, condescending, as if explaining something to a child who didn't understand what was good for him. Did they tell you what you were getting? Because if they misrepresented, they represented exactly what I needed. Clyde cut him off, the words coming fast and certain. My wife has more practical skill than anyone I've met. She read that storm while the sky was still clear, knew it was coming before I saw any sign, held my house together when it should have collapsed, and right now we have work to finish. He paused, letting the words land. So if you came to help, we appreciate it. If you came to judge, you can leave. Silence stretched between them, tension thickening the air. Webb's face reddened, his jaw clenching. Carson's expression remained carefully neutral, but something shifted behind his eyes, calculation perhaps, or reassessment, like watching someone solve a puzzle he'd thought was impossible. No judgment, Harrove. Carson straightened in his saddle, his voice softening slightly. Just making sure you're all right, that you weren't taken advantage of. I am perfectly capable of determining if I've been taken advantage of. Clyde felt Kaia's presence beside him, solid and steady, like an anchor in rough seas. And I can assure you, I haven't been. The third rider, who'd stayed quiet until now, finally spoke, an older man Clyde recognized as Miller, one of the town council members. Storm took down part of the road into town. Wagons can't get through for supplies. Town's organizing a work party to repair it. Could use extra hands if you can spare the time. When? 3 days. Meet at first light by the bridge. We'll be there. Kaia spoke before Clyde could respond, her voice carrying absolute certainty. Both of us. Webb's eyes widened, shock breaking through his attempted composure. Women don't usually. I am not usual. Kaia's voice remained level, but something in it made Webb's mouth snap shut like he'd been slapped. And if the road is broken, everyone who uses it should help repair it. This is simple logic. Carson nodded slowly, a slight smile touching his lips, respect breaking through prejudice, or at least the beginning of it. Fair enough. 3 days, then. The riders turned to leave, but Carson paused, looking back at Clyde with an expression that was harder to read now. Harrove, for what it's worth, you look better than you have in years, less like a man barely holding on. He rode off before Clyde could respond, the three of them disappearing into the distance, leaving dust hanging in the air like unspoken words, like questions without answers. Clyde turned to Kaia, still processing what had just happened. You didn't have to defend me like that. I was not defending you. She picked up the tool they'd set down, her movements crisp and efficient. I was stating facts. You needed skill. I have it. They question this because it does not match their expectations of how the world should work. Their problem, not ours. They'll talk in town. About us. About you. Let them talk. She returned to the fence, kneeling to examine their work with critical eyes. Talking changes nothing. Our work continues regardless of what people say, and comfortable rooms will never enter. Clyde watched her resume the repairs, her movements confident and sure, unbothered by judgment that would have devastated him a week ago, that had devastated him repeatedly over 3 lonely years. She was right, of course. What did it matter what Carson or Webb or anyone else thought? What mattered was here, now, the work in front of them, the partnership they were building day by day. But he couldn't shake the memory of how those men had looked at her, the judgment in their eyes, the assumption that she was somehow less than what he deserved, when it was exactly the opposite, when she was so far beyond what he'd imagined needing that comparison became meaningless. You were afraid. Kaia spoke without looking up, her focus on the fence post she was securing. When they rode up, your breathing changed. Not afraid of them. Clyde knelt beside her, picking up his end of the work, settling into their rhythm. Afraid of how they'd see you, of what they'd think. And now? Now I realize I care less about what they think than I thought I did. He fit a post into the hole they'd dug, his movements more confident than they'd been days ago. They looked at you like you were something wrong, something lesser. Yes. But you're not. She paused, meeting his eyes with an expression that was almost gentle. No, I am not. You're stronger than any of them, smarter, more capable. I know. She said it without arrogance, without pride, simple fact, like stating that the sky is blue or the desert is dry. And you are beginning to know it too. He nodded, something loosening in his chest, the weight of other people's expectations, the burden of needing approval from men who'd never offered him more than surface courtesy, who'd tolerated his presence but never truly accepted him. What had he been seeking from them anyway? Permission to exist? Validation that he mattered? 3 days until the work party, Kaia said, securing the post with practiced efficiency. That gives us time to finish this section, make it stronger than before. Stronger than before. Clyde liked the sound of that, the way it could apply to more than just the fence, to the house, to the land, to them. They worked through the afternoon, the encounter with the townsman fading into background noise, becoming just another thing that had happened and then passed, leaving them unchanged where it mattered. What mattered was here, the work in front of them, the partnership developing between two people who'd started as complete strangers bound by a contract neither had fully understood. As the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold, in colors that made even destruction look beautiful, Clyde realized something with sudden clarity. He'd stopped thinking of Kaia as the wrong bride. She wasn't the bride he'd ordered. That was true, factual, undeniable. But increasingly, she felt like exactly the partner he'd needed all along, the one who would challenge him to be better than comfortable, to reach for more than safe, to build something real instead of just surviving day to day. He just hadn't known it yet, hadn't known to ask for it, hadn't known it was possible. And as they walked back to the house together, their shadows stretching long and parallel across the land, their footsteps falling into unconscious synchronization, Clyde wondered if she felt it too. This shift, this change from obligation to something that might, with time and patience and continued choice, become something deeper, something chosen rather than imposed. He didn't ask. Some things needed time to grow without being examined too closely, needed to develop in darkness and silence the way seeds germinate underground, invisible but vitally alive. But he thought about it as they prepared dinner together, moving around the small space with increasing familiarity, no longer awkward, no longer strangers navigating around each other, but something more fluid, more natural. Thought about it as they sat across from each other, eating in companionable silence that felt comfortable rather than tense, that spoke of acceptance rather than endurance. And when Kaia spread her blanket by the fire that night, Clyde noticed she placed it slightly closer to his bed than before. Not much, maybe a foot, maybe less, but enough to be noticeable, enough to be deliberate, enough to suggest that the distance between them was shrinking one small increment at a time, geography reflecting emotional truth. He lay awake longer than usual, listening to her breathing settle into sleep's rhythm, listening to the night sounds outside, to the wind moving through the repaired roof without finding entrance, to the walls holding steady against the desert's constant testing. Everything was different than it had been a week ago. His careful isolation broken, his assumptions shattered, his plans completely overturned, his comfortable delusions stripped away by reality, arriving in the form of a 7-foot Apache woman who'd destroyed every expectation he'd ever held about what he needed, what he wanted, what was possible. And somehow, Impossibly, inexplicably, he felt more certain of his future than he ever had when he'd been alone, when he'd been safe, when he'd been slowly dying of isolation and calling it independence. The certainty was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating, and it was real. For the first time in his life, something felt genuinely, dangerously, beautifully real. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where two people discover that the best things in life are the ones you never knew to ask for. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Your support keeps these stories coming, and we've got more frontier adventures that'll keep you hooked, from the first word to the last.